On the remote shores of a conquered Pacific island, a ritual born of desperation and a lifetime of indoctrination was about to unfold. They were the Comfort Women, a living sacrifice offered to placate the gods of war and the ravenous appetites of the Imperial Army. But as the American invasion fleet appeared on the horizon, a different kind of terror took hold. Their purpose, once a grim necessity, now seemed like a death sentence. The men who would take them would not be their own, but a foreign enemy, a demon horde from a distant land. They had been told these Americans were savages, rapists, and murderers. And yet, what unfolded in the aftermath of the invasion was a scene that defied every one of their expectations. A moment of profound, unsettling humanity that would forever haunt their memories. The silence on Okinawa was a lie. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of 1,000 battles, with the unspoken prayers of the living and the groans of the dying. The year was 1945, and the island, once a tranquil haven of sugar-cane fields and emerald hills, had become the final, bloody battleground of the Pacific War. For a group of young Japanese women, sequestered in a makeshift compound deep within the Shuri Castle defenses, the war was an abstract, distant rumble. They were the Volunteer Corps, a euphemism for what they truly were, comfort women or ianfu, a human offering to the brutal, grinding machinery of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their days were a monotonous cycle of fear and a grim, forced cheerfulness. They cleaned, they cooked, and they waited. They waited for the knock on the door, the silent, terrifying signal that their purpose, their sacrifice, was once again required. Among them was a young woman named Kiyomi. At 19, she had the delicate features of a geisha in training, but her eyes, haunted and weary, held a wisdom far beyond her years. She had been recruited from her small village in Kyushu, a victim of a system that preyed on poverty and patriotic fervor. Her family had received a small sum, a pittance for the life of their daughter. She had been told she was serving the emperor, a sacred duty. But the reality was a living nightmare. Each soldier who came to her was a different shade of despair. Some were rough, their desperation a physical assault. Others were silent, their shame a palpable weight in the small, stifling room. She had learned to detach, to float above her body like a ghost, to pretend the violation was happening to someone else. It was the only way she could survive. The compound was a grim, gray building, a former schoolhouse repurposed for this grim purpose. The windows were boarded up, and the air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, cheap incense, and stale cigarette smoke. The only sounds were the distant thunder of artillery and the low, muffled conversations of the other women. There were dozens of them, from all corners of Japan and its conquered territories, each with her own story of coercion and deceit. They were a sisterhood of sorrow, bound by a shared trauma they dared not speak of. They spoke of home, of the food they missed, of the mothers and fathers they would never see again. They spoke of everything but the truth of their lives. Their supervisor, a stern, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Tanaka, was a figure of cold authority. She had been with the army for years, and her face was a mask of perpetual disapproval. She believed in the mission, in the righteousness of their sacrifice. She saw them not as human beings, but as tools of the state, their bodies a weapon in the war effort. She would lecture them on their duty, on the importance of maintaining morale. "You are the flowers of the empire," she would say, her voice as hard as stone. "You must bloom even in the face of death." One evening, as the sun bled a fiery red across the horizon, a young officer, Captain Sato, a man Kiyomi had a particular, visceral dread of, burst into the compound. His face was pale, his uniform streaked with mud and blood. He was a man of immense cruelty, a sadist who took pleasure in their suffering. But tonight his eyes were wide with a different kind of fear. He didn't look at any of the women. He just stood in the doorway, his body shaking. "They are here," he rasped, his voice a whisper. "The Americans." "The demon horde." A hush fell over the room, a silence so profound it was deafening. The distant rumble of artillery suddenly seemed to grow closer, louder. It was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate, terrifying reality. They had been told for months that the Americans were coming, but they had always believed in the invincibility of the Imperial Army. Now, in Captain Sato's eyes, they saw the truth. The invincibility was a lie. The Empire was losing. And they, the comfort women, were about to become a prize of war. They knew what that meant. They had been told what the Americans did to captured women. They had been told they were savages, rapists, and murderers. And they had been told it was their duty to die rather than be captured. The silent pact of self-destruction hung in the air, a grim, final promise. The next day, the sound of the world ended. A deafening roar, a symphony of fire and steel, descended upon the island. The earth shook, the very air trembled. The battle for Okinawa had begun in earnest. The women huddled together in the dark, their prayers silent, their fear a living thing. They could hear the screams, the shouts, the metallic shriek of tanks, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. The world they knew, the grim, predictable world of their captivity, was being torn apart. And as the sounds of battle grew closer, a new, more terrifying question began to dawn on them. What would happen to them when the Americans found them? Would the demon horde be as merciless as they had been told? Or would they be even worse? The siege of Shuri Castle was a descent into hell. The Americans, relentless and methodical, pressed their attack. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in a labyrinth of caves and tunnels, fought with a fanaticism born of desperation and the fear of dishonor. The once elegant castle grounds were now a blasted wasteland of splintered trees and shattered stone. The comfort women, still huddled in their compound, were now on the front lines of a war that had always been fought around them, but never directly with them. The walls of their grim sanctuary shook with every explosion. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the sweet, cloying stench of death. They no longer had enough food or water. Mrs. Tanaka, their supervisor, had become a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her lectures on duty replaced by a quiet, resigned despair. Kiyomi watched as the other women began to crack. One young girl, no older than 15, began to sing old nursery rhymes to herself, her eyes wide and unseeing. Another woman, a quiet seamstress from Tokyo, began to tear at her hair, her sobs the only sound in the suffocating silence. Kiyomi, however, felt a strange, detached calm. She had already lost everything. Her body, her dignity, her future. What was left to fear? She had been told to die honorably, but she found she had no desire to die. The instinct to survive, a raw, primal force, was stronger than the indoctrination. She wanted to see her village again, to feel the sun on her face, to eat a bowl of hot rice with her family. It was a selfish, forbidden thought, but it was the only thing that kept her sane. The American advance was a slow, inexorable march. They moved like a force of nature, their firepower overwhelming, their numbers inexhaustible. The Japanese soldiers, emaciated and exhausted, were being pushed back, their lines breaking. The compound was now in the direct path of the American assault. They could hear the voices of the Americans now, a strange guttural language. They could see the flashes of their rifles, the dark shapes of their bodies moving through the ruins of the castle. The time for waiting was over. Mrs. Tanaka, her voice barely a whisper, called them together. Her face was ashen, her eyes filled with a terrifying final resolve. "They are coming," she said, her voice trembling. "The demons are at the gate. We have a sacred duty, to die with honor, to not let ourselves be defiled by the enemy." She produced a long, ceremonial dagger. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, its blade glinting in the dim light. "We will die together," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We will show them the spirit of Japan. We will show them that we will not be taken." A wave of dread washed over the women. They had been told to do this. They had been prepared for this. But faced with the reality of it, many of them shrank back. The young seamstress began to sob uncontrollably. The girl who sang her nursery rhymes stared at the dagger, her face a mask of bewildered terror. Kiyomi, however, felt a cold, defiant rage. This was not honor. This was suicide. This was the final act of a cruel, uncaring system that had already taken so much from them. She would not let it take her life, too. Just as Mrs. Tanaka raised the dagger, a new sound cut through the air. It was not the sound of a gun or an explosion. It was the sound of a human voice, amplified, distorted. It was speaking a strange, alien language, but it was not a shout of anger or triumph. It was a low, steady sound. And then, a moment later, a translation in Japanese crackled over the loudspeaker. "We are American soldiers," the voice said, slow and deliberate. We are here to help. Lay down your arms. You will not be harmed. We will not touch you. You will be safe." The words hung in the air, a strange, unbelievable promise. The women looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Mrs. Tanaka, her hand still clutching the dagger, froze. She had told them the Americans were demons. But demons did not speak of help or safety. The voice repeated the message over and over, its steady, monotonous rhythm a strange comfort in the chaos. And then, the door to the compound burst open. An American soldier stood in the doorway, his silhouette a hulking shadow against the daylight. He was a giant of a man, his helmet and uniform covered in mud and grime. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, his hands were empty. Behind him were more soldiers, their faces grim but not cruel. Mrs. Tanaka, with a final desperate gasp, lunged forward with the dagger. The American soldier, with a swift, fluid motion, disarmed her. He did not hurt her. He simply took the dagger from her hand, his movements precise and controlled. He then looked at the women, his eyes moving from one terrified face to the next. He said something in his language. It was a question. The interpreter, a young, nervous Japanese-American soldier, translated. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" The women stood frozen, unable to comprehend the scene. This was not the demon horde they had been told to expect. This was something else entirely. The American soldier, his face kind, his eyes full of a strange, unsettling pity, reached out a hand. He was not reaching for a weapon or a woman. He was reaching for a box of rations. He opened it and offered a chocolate bar to the girl who had been singing. She recoiled in terror. He didn't press her. He simply placed the chocolate bar on the floor, took a step back, and waited. The silence in the room was now a new kind of silence. It was the silence of shocked disbelief. They had been prepared for violence, for defilement, for death. They had not been prepared for a simple, quiet act of human kindness. What did this mean? Was this a trick? A new, more insidious form of torture? Their fear was now a complex, tangled mess of suspicion and a glimmer of an emotion they hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The American soldiers moved with a quiet efficiency that was as unnerving as their earlier, terrifying, televised image as demons. They were not screaming, they were not looting, and they were not touching the women. Instead, they were setting up a temporary camp outside the compound. They brought in water, food, and medical supplies. They laid out blankets and erected a makeshift tent. The young Japanese-American interpreter, a man named Kenji, who was as bewildered by the situation as the women were, explained that they were to be taken to a safe place, a place called a refugee camp. The term was a foreign concept, a place of safety in the middle of a war zone. It sounded too good to be true. Kiyomi watched the soldiers, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She saw one of the American soldiers, a tall, red-headed man with a kind, open face, sit down on the ground and begin to clean his rifle. He was not looking at them, not leering at them, not even acknowledging their presence. It was as if they were invisible. Another soldier, a young boy who looked no older than she was handing out small cans of peaches. He would offer them to the women, and when they recoiled, he would simply place the can on the ground and walk away. He never touched them. He never spoke to them. His eyes were sad, as if he pitied them. The women, however, were still a coiled spring of fear and suspicion. This was not the behavior of the enemy they had been told to expect. Mrs. Tanaka, now under guard, her face a mask of impotent rage, kept muttering to herself about American trickery and their insidious plots. She warned the women not to eat the food, not to drink the water. "It is poison," she hissed. "They want us to die a slow, agonizing death." But the hunger was a primal force, and some of the women, after days of starvation, began to hesitantly reach for the cans of peaches. They ate with a kind of desperate, animalistic hunger, their eyes darting around as if expecting to be struck down at any moment. But nothing happened. The food was good. The water was clean. The American officer in charge of the detail, a man named Captain Miller, was a study in controlled compassion. He was a veteran of the European theater, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had come to expect it. But he had been given explicit orders. No one touches the women. The orders had come from the highest levels of command. The military had anticipated the discovery of comfort women compounds, and they had prepared a protocol. They knew the women would be terrified. They knew they had been indoctrinated with a lifetime of anti-American propaganda. They knew that their every expectation would be to be violated and killed. And so the protocol was simple. Do the opposite. Treat them with respect. Treat them with humanity. Do not touch them. Let them see that the enemy they had been told to expect was not the enemy that had arrived. Captain Miller was a pragmatic man. He didn't know the full history of the comfort women system, but he understood the basics. He understood that these women were victims, not soldiers. He understood that they were terrified. He had seen their terror. It was a familiar look, the look of a person who has lost all hope. He had seen it on the faces of the concentration camp survivors in Germany, and so he treated them with the same quiet, firm respect. He did not speak to them directly. He spoke to Kenji, the interpreter. He gave his orders in a low, even tone. "Tell them they are safe," he would say. "Tell them no one will harm them. Tell them we are taking them to a place where they can get medical care and rest." Kenji, a young Nisei from California, was in a world of his own. He had joined the army to prove his loyalty, to fight for a country that had imprisoned his family in internment camps. He had never been to Japan. His Japanese was rusty. His knowledge of the culture was limited to what his grandmother had told him. He had been a farm boy, a shy, quiet kid who had been shoved into this grim new world. He looked at the women, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance, and he felt a profound, unsettling pity. He knew what they were. He had heard the rumors, and he felt a strange kinship with them. They were Japanese. He was Japanese. But they were on opposite sides of a bloody war. He tried to speak to them, to tell them his story, to bridge the cultural and emotional gap. But they would only look at him with suspicion. He was one of them, but he was also one of the enemy. The women's fear began to slowly, imperceptibly thaw. The American soldiers were a constant, quiet presence. They brought them food, they brought them water, they brought them blankets. They never spoke to them, never touched them. It was a strange, silent ritual of kindness that slowly began to chip away at the walls of fear they had built around themselves. Kiyomi, in particular, was the most observant. She watched as one of the soldiers, the tall, red-headed one, took a small bird from a broken tree branch and gently set it on the ground. She saw another one, a young boy with a gentle face, share his candy with a local Okinawan child. They were not demons. They were not savages. They were men. Men who were just as tired, just as frightened, and just as lost as they were. The realization was both a comfort and a new kind of terror. If they were not demons, what were they? And what did they want? This kindness, this strange, unsettling compassion was a mystery, a puzzle she could not solve. She had been taught that the enemy was pure evil. But pure evil did not give you food or water or a blanket. Pure evil did not leave you untouched. And so a new kind of terror began to grow in her heart. The terror of the unknown. The terror of not knowing what to expect next. The journey to the refugee camp was a surreal procession. The women, wrapped in blankets and their own fear, were loaded onto the back of an American military truck. The soldiers, a silent, watchful presence, sat on the sides of the truck bed, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The truck moved slowly over the cratered, war-torn roads of Okinawa. The landscape was a testament to the brutality of the conflict. The fields were churned mud, the trees were splintered stumps, and the air was thick with the lingering scent of smoke and death. It was a scene of utter desolation. Kiyomi sat with the other women, her eyes wide as she took in the ruined landscape. She had never seen such destruction. She had only heard the sounds of the war, the distant thunder of the guns. Now she was seeing the aftermath. The sight filled her with a profound, overwhelming sadness. This was her home, her country, and it was broken. It was a feeling of loss so deep it was almost physical. She looked at the American soldiers, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the horizon. They were the ones who had done this, and yet they were the ones who were now taking her to a place of safety. The paradox was almost unbearable. The camp was a large, sprawling collection of tents, set up in a field that had been recently cleared. It was a city of canvas and desperation. There were thousands of people there, all Japanese civilians, all refugees from the fighting. There were old men with haunted eyes, young mothers clutching their children, and orphaned children wandering around, their faces a mask of confusion. The sight was overwhelming. Kiyomi and the other women were led to a separate section of the camp, a small enclosed area that was guarded by American military police. They were given clean clothes, a change from their worn, filthy kimonos. They were given hot food and clean water. They were given medical attention. The American doctors, their faces kind, their hands gentle, examined them for injuries, for illnesses. They were treated not as objects of a grim transaction, but as human beings. The women were still a silent, fearful group. They sat together, huddled in a circle, their eyes darting around, watching the Americans, watching the other refugees. The other refugees, in turn, looked at them with a strange mixture of pity and suspicion. They knew what they were. The whispers had already begun. The term Ayanfu was whispered from person to person, a word of shame and degradation. But the Americans, they were told, did not care. They only saw them as victims of war. It was a strange, new reality to navigate. Kiyomi, however, felt a strange, unsettling pull towards the world outside their small enclosure. She watched the American soldiers as they interacted with the refugees. She saw them handing out candy to the children, playing baseball with the older boys, and listening patiently to the stories of the old men. They were not the demons they had been told about. They were men. They laughed. They joked. They were tired. They were homesick. She saw one of the soldiers, the young boy who had given her the peaches, sit down with an old woman and share his cigarette. He spoke to her in broken Japanese, but he was trying. He was making an effort to connect, to bridge the divide. It was a sight that filled her with a strange, unsettling hope. One evening, as the sun was setting, the young Japanese-American interpreter, Kenji, came to their enclosure. He looked tired. His face was pale and his eyes were sad. He had been trying for days to get them to talk, to tell him their stories, but they had all remained silent. Kiyomi, however, felt a strange, inexplicable desire to speak to him. He was like her, but not like her. He was a bridge to a world she did not understand. He spoke in broken Japanese. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, his voice soft, "that I am sorry. I am sorry for what you have been through. I am sorry for the war." Kiyomi looked at him, her eyes wide. He was not a soldier who had come to them with demands. He was a man who had come to them with an apology. It was an act of humanity that she had not expected. She looked at the other women. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and suspicion. They had been told to hate him, to hate the Americans. But how could she hate a man who was offering her an apology? She felt the rigid walls of her indoctrination begin to crack. She felt a question form on her lips. A question she had been too afraid to ask. "Why?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. "Why are you doing this? Why are you not touching us?" Kenji looked at her. His eyes filled with a sad, profound understanding. He had been waiting for this question. He took a deep breath. "Because," he said, his voice quiet, "we are not demons. We are not savages. We are men, and we are here to help you, not to harm you. We are here to show you that we are not the monsters you were told we were. We are here to show you a different kind of war, a war where even in the midst of the carnage, there is still room for humanity." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "We want you to live. We want you to be free. We want you to have a chance at a life that you were stolen from." His words hung in the air, a final, stunning revelation. They had been prepared for a final act of violence. They had been prepared for death. They had not been prepared for freedom. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting a long, mournful shadow over the camp, a new kind of fear, a new kind of hope, began to dawn in her heart. What would a life of freedom be like? Could she ever truly be free? The following days were a slow, agonizing process of decompression. The women, now in the relative safety of the refugee camp, began to emerge from their shells of fear. They spoke to Kenji, the interpreter, in hushed tones, their stories a litany of coercion, starvation, and unimaginable cruelty. Kiyomi, however, still held back. She watched the others, the way their faces contorted with shame and relief as they unburdened themselves. She was not ready. The memories were a physical weight, a poison she could not yet release. She still clung to the familiar, if grim, reality of her captivity. The world of freedom, of choice, was a strange, terrifying new concept. The American soldiers, in turn, were a study in compassionate disengagement. They did not pry, they did not judge, and they did not force them to talk. They simply provided a safe space, a quiet, non-judgmental environment for the women to begin their healing process. They were a constant, quiet presence, a wall of protection against the rest of the camp. Captain Miller, the commanding officer, was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He would often come by the enclosure, his presence a silent assurance that they were safe. He would stand at a distance, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the area, a silent sentinel of their fragile new freedom. He saw them not as a group of comfort women, but as a group of human beings who had been brutalized by a system of their own making. He saw in them a profound sorrow that he had seen in the faces of victims all over the world. One afternoon, Kiyomi was sitting alone, her back against a tent, her eyes closed. She was trying to conjure the image of her village, the smell of the ocean, the feel of the sun on her face. A sound broke her reverie. It was the young American soldier, the one who had given her the peaches. He was standing a few feet away holding a small book. He did not speak. He simply opened the book and began to draw. He was a surprisingly skilled artist, his charcoal strokes quick and sure. He drew the landscape of Okinawa, the jagged mountains, the gnarled trees, the ruins of the castle. He was not drawing them. He was not looking at her. He was simply drawing the world around them, a world they had all lost. Kiyomi watched him, fascinated. He was not a soldier. He was a boy. He was an artist. He was a human being who found comfort in creating beauty from the ashes of war. She felt a strange, unbidden sense of connection to him. He was not trying to save her. He was not trying to fix her. He was simply existing in the same space, a shared space of loss and quiet desperation. He was not touching her, but he was reaching out to her in a way no one ever had. After a while, he closed the book and, without looking at her, placed it on the ground beside her. Then he walked away. Kiyomi, her heart pounding, reached for the book. She opened it and saw not only the drawings of the landscape, but a small, careful drawing of a single cherry blossom. It was perfect. It was delicate. It was a symbol of her home, of her country, of a beauty she thought she had lost forever. She looked at the drawing, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was a simple act, a small, quiet act of kindness, but it was a bridge. It was a bridge from her world of darkness and pain to a new world of light and hope. It was a new kind of language, a language of empathy and shared humanity that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The days in the camp began to blend together. The women, little by little, began to talk, to laugh, to eat, to live again. They were no longer the silent, huddled mass of fear. They were individuals, each with her own story, her own trauma, and her own hope for the future. They began to help the Americans, to help with the sick, to help with the children. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were allies in a shared struggle to survive. They were no longer comfort women. They were women. And the American soldiers, they were no longer demons. They were men. The shift in their collective consciousness was a subtle, profound thing. The world they had known, the world of absolute certainty, of black and white, of good and evil, was gone. It had been replaced by a new world, a world of shades of gray, a world of moral ambiguity, a world of quiet, profound humanity. They had been prepared to die with honor, but they had been given a chance to live with dignity. It was a gift they had never expected, and it was a gift that would change them forever. But as the war continued to rage around them, as the whispers of the coming atomic bombs began to circulate, a new fear began to take hold. The war was not over yet. What would happen to them when it finally ended? What would happen when the Americans, their unexpected saviors, finally left? The surrender of Japan was a moment of surreal silence. One day, the air was filled with the thud of artillery and the roar of planes. The next, it was still. The war was over. The silence was a physical weight, a final, conclusive punctuation mark on a long, brutal chapter of history. The American soldiers, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion, began to pack up their camps. The war was over for them. They were going home. For the Japanese refugees, and especially for the comfort women, the end of the war was not a moment of unbridled joy. It was a moment of profound, unsettling uncertainty. What would happen to them now? The American soldiers, the ones who had been their silent protectors, their unexpected saviors, were leaving. They would be left to navigate a broken, war-torn country, a country that had abandoned them once before. They were no longer protected by the American army. They were no longer in a safe zone. They were once again alone. Kiyomi watched as the trucks were loaded with equipment, as the tents were taken down, as the camp was slowly, methodically dismantled. She saw the young American soldier, the artist, pack up his things. He saw her watching him. He did not speak, but he gave her a small, sad smile. It was a final, silent farewell. She felt a profound, aching sadness. He was not a demon. He was a boy who drew cherry blossoms. And he was leaving. She knew she would never see him again. The American soldier's departure was a slow, painful process. They were the last bastion of hope in a world that had lost all hope. When they left, the world would once again be a place of fear and uncertainty. The Japanese government, a government that had betrayed them, would be the ones to take over. What would happen to them then? Would they be forgotten? Would they be a source of shame? Would they be left to fend for themselves? Captain Miller, the pragmatic commander, had seen this coming. He had tried to prepare the women for this moment. He had worked with the remaining Japanese officials to ensure their safety. He had arranged for them to be taken to a new permanent camp, a place where they would be given food, shelter, and a chance to rebuild their lives. But he knew it was not enough. He knew that the emotional scars of their ordeal would never truly heal. He knew that they would always be the Ianfu, the comfort women, the forgotten victims of a war no one wanted to remember. The day came when the last American truck drove out of the camp. Kiyomi stood with the other women, watching it go. The dust kicked up by the tires settled on the empty field. The silence was absolute. They were alone. The world they had known for the past few months, the strange, unsettling world of compassion and humanity, was gone. It had been replaced by a new, more terrifying reality. The war was over, but their battle had just begun. They had survived the demon horde, but could they survive a world that had forgotten them? Could they find a place in a society that had cast them aside? Could they ever truly be free? The answer was a long, painful silence, a silence filled with the ghosts of 1,000 battles, with the unspoken prayers of the living and the uncertain future that lay ahead.